The autumn of 1999 painted Millbrook University in shades of amber and crimson, the kind of picturesque New England campus that appeared on brochures and in the dreams of high school seniors across the country. Nestled in the rolling hills of western Massachusetts, the small liberal arts college had cultivated a reputation for academic excellence and tight-knit community bonds that stretched back over 2 centuries. It was the kind of place where professors knew their students by name, where dorm room doors remained unlocked, and where the most scandalous news typically involved stolen exam papers or underage drinking citations. But on the evening of October 15, 1999, something far more sinister would shatter that idyllic veneer forever. Jessica Morrison had always been the type of person who illuminated every room she entered. At 19, the psychology major from Portland, Maine, possessed an infectious laugh that could dissolve tension and a compassionate nature that drew troubled souls like moths to flame. Her dormmates in Wellington Hall often found themselves confiding their deepest fears and secrets to her during late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Jessica never judged, never betrayed a confidence, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to make someone feel less alone in the world. On that particular Friday evening, Jessica sat cross-legged on her narrow dorm bed, surrounded by psychology textbooks and color-coded note cards. Her roommate, Katie Phillips, was getting ready for a party at the Sigma Alpha Epsilon house, carefully applying mascara while complaining about her upcoming organic chemistry exam. "You sure you don't want to come?" Katie asked for the 3rd time, checking her reflection in their shared mirror. "David will be there, and you know he's been asking about you." David Walsh was a junior majoring in English literature, a quiet and introspective young man whose poetry had been published in the campus literary magazine 3 times in the past year. He had been harboring feelings for Jessica since they'd been paired together in Professor Morrison's Victorian literature seminar the previous spring. But his attempts at romantic connection had been met with Jessica's characteristic kindness and gentle deflection. Jessica smiled without looking up from her abnormal psychology textbook. "I really need to finish this chapter on dissociative disorders. Tell David I said hello, though." The irony of those words would haunt Katie Phillips for the rest of her life. At approximately 9:47 p.m., according to campus security logs, Jessica Morrison left Wellington Hall through the rear entrance. She wore dark jeans, a burgundy Millbrook University sweatshirt, and white Adidas sneakers that had seen better days. Security cameras captured her walking purposefully across the quad toward the library, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a steaming cup of coffee in her free hand. The Whitman Memorial Library stood like a Gothic fortress at the heart of campus, its stone gargoyles leering down at students who dared to enter its hallowed halls after sunset. Built in 1847, the structure had been renovated countless times over the decades, but retained its maze-like quality that confused even senior students. The basement levels in particular were a labyrinth of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and forgotten archives that few people ever had reason to visit. Library records show that Jessica used her student ID to enter the building at 9:52 p.m. She never used it to leave. When Katie Phillips returned from the SAE party at 2:30 a.m., stumbling slightly from too much cheap beer and loud music, she found their dorm room empty. Jessica's textbooks remained spread across her bed exactly as Katie had left them, her coffee mug still sitting on the desk with a thin film of condensation around its base. It wasn't entirely unusual for Jessica to stay out late, particularly when she was helping a friend through a crisis, so Katie simply assumed her roommate would return before morning. But morning came without Jessica Morrison. Professor Eleanor Hartford discovered something was wrong when Jessica failed to appear for her Saturday morning research methods class. In 3 years of teaching, Professor Hartford had never known Jessica to miss a class without prior notification. The young woman was the type of student who attended lectures even while running a fever, who turned in assignments early, who stayed after class to discuss theoretical implications that most of her peers found tediously abstract. By noon on Saturday, Katie Phillips had called campus security. Officer Michael Torres was a 28-year-old former Marine who had joined the Millbrook University security force 2 years earlier, seeking a quieter life after his discharge from active duty. He had handled his share of missing student reports during his tenure, most involved freshmen who had passed out in friends' rooms after particularly rowdy parties, or upperclassmen who had taken impromptu road trips without informing their roommates. In nearly every case, the missing students returned within 24 hours with sheepish grins and stories they preferred not to share with their parents. But something about Jessica Morrison's disappearance felt different from the moment Officer Torres began his preliminary investigation. Jessica's student ID had been used to enter the library at 9:52 p.m. on Friday, but there was no corresponding exit scan. The overnight security guard, an elderly man named Frank Costello, who had worked at the library for over 15 years, insisted that he had checked every floor during his rounds and found no students inside when the building was locked at midnight. Frank's reputation for thoroughness was legendary among the student body. He was known to search behind every bookshelf and under every table before securing the building for the night. Security cameras throughout the campus showed Jessica walking toward the library, but no footage captured her leaving. The cameras inside the library itself were limited to the main entrances and the circulation desk, leaving vast blind spots throughout the building's interior. Officer Torres spent Saturday afternoon retracing Jessica's steps, interviewing her friends and professors, searching for any clue that might explain her sudden disappearance. What he discovered painted a picture of a young woman who had no enemies, no secret boyfriends, no hidden struggles with mental health or substance abuse. Jessica Morrison seemed to exist in a bubble of universal affection and respect that made her vanishing all the more perplexing. David Walsh was among the first people Torres interviewed. The young man appeared genuinely distraught when informed of Jessica's disappearance, his face draining of color as he sank into a chair in the campus security office. "She was supposed to come to the party," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Katie said she was studying, but I kept hoping she might change her mind." "When was the last time you spoke with Jessica?" Torres asked, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. "Thursday afternoon, after Professor Morrison's class. We were talking about Tennyson's In Memoriam, and she had this fascinating theory about the relationship between grief and identity formation." David's voice cracked slightly. "She was brilliant, you know, not just smart, but genuinely insightful in ways that made you see the world differently." The investigation expanded on Sunday when Jessica's parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, arrived from Maine. Robert Morrison was a successful commercial fisherman whose weathered hands and sun-damaged face spoke to decades of hard work on the Atlantic Ocean. Linda Morrison taught 3rd grade at a Portland elementary school and possessed the same gentle demeanor that had made her daughter so beloved among her peers. The Morrisons' arrival transformed what had been a routine missing person case into something that carried the weight of genuine tragedy. Their obvious anguish, combined with their daughter's spotless reputation, convinced campus administrators that this was no ordinary student disappearance. By Monday morning, the Millbrook Police Department had officially taken over the investigation from campus security. Detective Ray Kowalski, a 35-year veteran of the force who had handled every major crime in the small college town for the past 2 decades, found himself confronting the most puzzling case of his career. Detective Kowalski was a methodical man who approached investigations like a chess master, considering every possible move and countermove before committing to a strategy. He had solved murders, sexual assaults, and armed robberies through patient analysis and relentless attention to detail. But Jessica Morrison's disappearance offered him nothing tangible to work with, no witnesses, no physical evidence, no apparent motive for anyone to harm her. The detective's first major decision was to conduct a comprehensive search of the Whitman Memorial Library. Beginning Tuesday morning, teams of officers systematically examined every room, every alcove, every storage closet in the sprawling building. They discovered forgotten collections of 19th-century botanical specimens, boxes of student newspapers dating back to the 1920s, and mechanical equipment that hadn't been used in decades. But they found no trace of Jessica Morrison. The basement levels proved particularly challenging to search. The building's original foundation had been expanded multiple times over the decades, creating a maze of interconnected rooms and corridors that even the library staff didn't fully understand. Some areas required bolt cutters to access, their locks rusted into place by years of neglect. Others were so cluttered with forgotten archives and obsolete equipment that searchers had to create pathways just to move through them. In one of the sub-basement storage rooms, investigators discovered something that briefly raised their hopes. A single burgundy thread, caught on a rough piece of concrete near the room's entrance, appeared to match the color of Jessica's sweatshirt. Crime scene technicians carefully collected the fiber and sent it to the state police laboratory for analysis. The results were disappointing. While the thread was indeed burgundy and appeared to be cotton blend consistent with a university sweatshirt, it could not be definitively linked to Jessica's clothing. The laboratory report noted that hundreds of similar garments were sold in the campus bookstore each year, making the fiber evidence essentially meaningless. As October stretched into November, the investigation began to take on an increasingly desperate quality. Detective Kowalski expanded his search beyond the campus, interviewing residents of the surrounding community, checking with hospitals throughout western Massachusetts, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across New England. Missing person flyers bearing Jessica's smiling photograph appeared in post offices, grocery stores, and gas stations throughout the region. The media attention was intense, but respectful. Jessica's story resonated with parents across the country, who saw their own children in the images of the missing college student. Television news crews descended on Millbrook University, broadcasting live reports from the quad, where Jessica had taken her final steps into the unknown. Robert and Linda Morrison became fixtures on campus, refusing to return to Maine while their daughter remained missing. They rented a small apartment in downtown Millbrook and spent their days distributing flyers, coordinating with investigators, and holding vigil in the hope that Jessica might somehow find her way home. The psychological toll on the campus community was profound. Students who had never locked their doors began installing deadbolts. Parents who had encouraged their children's independence suddenly found themselves calling multiple times per day. The safe, insular world that Millbrook University had cultivated for over 2 centuries seemed to crumble overnight. Professor Hartford canceled her research methods class for the remainder of the semester, unable to face the empty seat where Jessica had always sat in the front row. David Walsh's poetry took on darker themes, exploring loss and uncertainty in ways that worried his friends and family. Katie Phillips transferred to a different dormitory, unable to sleep in the room she had shared with her missing friend. By December, with no new leads and no physical evidence to guide the investigation, Detective Kowalski was forced to acknowledge what everyone feared, but no one wanted to say aloud. Jessica Morrison had likely become the victim of foul play. The detective's working theory, developed through weeks of careful analysis, suggested that someone had abducted Jessica inside the library and somehow managed to remove her from the building without triggering any security systems. This scenario required detailed knowledge of the library's layout, its security procedures, and its numerous blind spots. It also suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime even more chilling. But who could have possessed such knowledge? And what possible motive could anyone have for harming Jessica Morrison? The list of suspects was frustratingly short. Library employees underwent extensive background checks and polygraph examinations, all of which they passed without raising suspicion. Security personnel were similarly scrutinized, with no evidence emerging to suggest their involvement. Even Frank Costello, the overnight guard who had insisted the building was empty when he locked it, submitted to multiple interviews and investigative procedures that cleared him of any wrongdoing. Students with access to the library during evening hours numbered in the hundreds, making individual investigation of each person practically impossible. Detective Kowalski focused on those who had demonstrated unusual interest in Jessica or had been present on campus the night she disappeared. But these inquiries yielded nothing substantial. David Walsh remained a person of interest primarily because of his unrequited feelings for Jessica, but extensive investigation revealed no evidence of stalking behavior or inappropriate contact. His alibi for the evening of October 15th was ironclad. Dozens of witnesses had seen him at the SAE party from 9:30 p.m. until well after midnight. As winter settled over Millbrook University, the investigation entered a holding pattern that would persist for months. Detective Kowalski continued following up on tips and leads as they emerged, but the flow of new information had slowed to a trickle. The case remained officially open, but resources were gradually shifted to more recent crimes with better prospects for resolution. The Morrison family returned to Maine just before Christmas, their faces etched with the kind of profound grief that comes from losing a child without ever knowing what happened to her. They had aged years in the span of 2 months, their hair grayer, their movements slower, their eyes holding a haunted quality that would never fully fade. Jessica Morrison's disappearance became part of campus lore, a cautionary tale shared with incoming freshmen during orientation week. Her photograph remained posted on bulletin boards throughout the university, gradually fading from repeated exposure to fluorescent lighting, but never removed. Students would sometimes claim to see her ghost wandering the library's corridors late at night, a manifestation of collective guilt and unresolved grief. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jessica's disappearance was how completely she seemed to have vanished. Despite extensive searches of the campus and surrounding area, despite hundreds of interviews and thousands of hours of investigative work, despite media attention that reached millions of people across the country, not a single piece of physical evidence had been found to explain what happened to her. It was as if Jessica Morrison had simply been erased from existence, leaving behind only memories and questions that would haunt Millbrook University for decades to come. Detective Kowalski retired in 2015, 16 years after Jessica's disappearance, but he never stopped thinking about the case. His replacement, Detective Maria Santos, inherited a file cabinet full of reports, evidence bags, and witness statements that had yielded no answers despite years of careful analysis. The case remained officially active, but with each passing year, the likelihood of resolution seemed to diminish. By 2020, most of the original investigators had either retired or moved on to other positions. The professors who had taught Jessica were approaching retirement themselves. Her college friends had married, started careers, raised children of their own. The world had moved forward, as it always does, leaving the mystery of Jessica Morrison's fate as an increasingly distant tragedy. The library where she vanished underwent major renovations in 2018, with updated security systems, modern lighting, and climate-controlled storage areas that eliminated many of the dark corners and forgotten spaces that had complicated the original search. The basement levels were reorganized and catalogued with meticulous care, but the workers found nothing that shed new light on the 20-year-old mystery. Frank Costello, the overnight security guard who had been the last person to search the library on the night of Jessica's disappearance, passed away in 2019 at the age of 78. He had never wavered in his insistence that the building was empty when he locked it on October 15, 1999, taking that certainty to his grave. Katie Phillips, now Katie Phillips Warren, lived in suburban Boston with her husband and 2 young children. She rarely spoke about her college years, and when she did, she never mentioned her missing roommate. The trauma of that experience had shaped her in ways she was still discovering, leaving her with an persistent anxiety about her own children's safety that her husband found difficult to understand. David Walsh had become a successful poet and creative writing professor at a small college in Vermont. His published collections often explored themes of loss and uncertainty, though he never wrote explicitly about Jessica Morrison. In interviews, he would sometimes mention that his work had been influenced by a profound experience of absence during his college years, but he declined to elaborate. Robert and Linda Morrison had aged into quiet acceptance of their daughter's fate, Though they never stopped hoping for answers, they established a scholarship in Jessica's name that provided financial assistance to psychology majors who demonstrated academic excellence and compassionate service to others. Each year they attended the scholarship presentation ceremony, their presence a dignified reminder of the young woman whose potential had been cut short. The Millbrook University campus had grown and changed dramatically since 1999 with new dormitories, academic buildings, and recreational facilities that transformed its physical landscape. But the Whitman Memorial Library remained largely unchanged, its Gothic architecture and maze-like interior serving as a monument to the mystery that had never been solved. Students still studied in the same rooms where Jessica had spent countless hours preparing for exams and writing papers. They still navigated the confusing basement levels in search of archived materials and forgotten resources. But few of them knew about the young woman who had vanished within those walls 25 years earlier, her story gradually fading from institutional memory, like everything else that doesn't directly affect the present moment. In the summer of 2024, those forgotten depths would finally yield their secrets, setting in motion a series of discoveries that would shock investigators, devastate a community, and force a reckoning with truths that had remained hidden for a quarter of a century. But that revelation lay months in the future, and for now, the mystery of Jessica Morrison remained exactly what it had been for 25 years. A question without an answer, a story without an ending, a life interrupted by circumstances that defied explanation or understanding. The autumn of 2024 would change everything. The renovation of Whitman Memorial Library's sub-basement was supposed to be a routine infrastructure upgrade, the kind of mundane project that university administrators approve without much fanfare or public attention. After 25 years of deferred maintenance, the aging mechanical systems beneath the Gothic structure had reached the point where replacement was no longer optional but essential. On the morning of July 18, 2024, construction supervisor Tommy Brennan descended into the library's deepest level with his crew of 6 workers, their hard hats and high-powered flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness that had shrouded these forgotten spaces for decades. The air hung thick with the smell of mold and rust, punctuated by the steady drip of condensation from overhead pipes that had been leaking for longer than anyone could remember. Brennan was a third-generation contractor whose family had worked on Millbrook University buildings since the 1990s. His grandfather had helped install the original electrical systems in several campus structures, and his father had overseen major renovations during the university's expansion in the 90s. Tommy himself had been working these corridors and hidden spaces for over 15 years, but he had never been tasked with accessing the deepest storage room in the library's foundation. Room B47 appeared on architectural plans dating back to 1923, when the library's foundation had been expanded to accommodate a new heating system, but university records showed no evidence that the room had been accessed since the 1970s, when it had briefly served as storage for obsolete card catalog systems. The heavy steel door bore multiple layers of institutional paint, its industrial lock corroded by decades of humidity and neglect. It took Brennan's crew nearly an hour to cut through the lock and force the door open. When they finally succeeded, their flashlight beams revealed a rectangular space, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, its concrete walls stained with moisture and decades of accumulated grime. The room appeared empty except for several deteriorating cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall and what looked like old furniture covered by moldy tarps. Brennan stepped into the room first, his boots echoing in the confined space as he swept his flashlight across the walls and ceiling. The construction supervisor was methodical by nature, trained to assess structural integrity and potential hazards before allowing his workers to proceed. But as his light passed over the covered furniture in the corner, something caught his attention that made him freeze in place. Protruding from beneath one of the tops was what appeared to be a human hand. The discovery set in motion a sequence of events that would transform the forgotten storage room into the most important crime scene in Millbrook University's history. Within minutes of Brennan's emergency call, campus security officers arrived to secure the area. Within an hour, Detective Maria Santos was standing in the doorway of room B47, staring at evidence that would redefine everything investigators thought they knew about Jessica Morrison's disappearance. The scene that greeted Detective Santos was both heartbreaking and horrifying in its implications. Beneath the rotting tarps lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a young woman, her bones positioned in a way that suggested she had been seated against the wall when death occurred. Fragments of burgundy fabric clung to her ribcage, and white sneakers still encased her feet, their once pristine surfaces now stained and deteriorated, but unmistakably consistent with the shoes Jessica Morrison had been wearing on the night she vanished. But Jessica Morrison was not alone in room. As crime scene technicians carefully documented the scene, they discovered the remains of a second individual positioned near the opposite wall. These bones belonged to a male, based on preliminary examination, and appeared to be roughly the same age as the female remains. Unlike Jessica's body, which bore no obvious signs of trauma, the male skeleton showed clear evidence of violence, a fractured skull that suggested blunt force trauma, and several broken ribs that indicated a prolonged struggle before death. The implications were staggering. For 25 years, investigators had operated under the assumption that Jessica Morrison had been abducted from the library and taken elsewhere. The possibility that she had died within the building itself, locked away in a forgotten room mere feet below where hundreds of students studied each day, represented a failure of investigation so profound that it threatened to destroy careers and reputations. Detective Santos, who had inherited the cold case 6 years earlier, found herself confronting evidence that should have been discovered decades ago. The room's existence was clearly documented in architectural plans available to anyone with access to the university's building records. The fact that it had never been thoroughly searched during the original investigation raised questions about the competence and thoroughness of her predecessors that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. But beyond the professional embarrassment and potential legal ramifications, the discovery in room B47 opened entirely new avenues of investigation that promised to finally answer the questions that had haunted the Morrison family for 25 years. Dr. Rebecca Lawson, the state medical examiner, arrived at the scene late that afternoon with a team of forensic anthropologists and crime scene specialists. A forensic pathologist with over 20 years of experience, Lawson had examined hundreds of crime scenes, but few had presented the unique challenges posed by remains that had been undisturbed for more than 2 decades. The process of recovering and documenting the evidence would take nearly a week, with technicians working in the cramped confines of room B47 to carefully excavate and catalog every fragment of bone, fabric, and personal effects. The room's concrete floor and walls had preserved the scene remarkably well, protecting it from the elements and scavenging animals that typically compromise outdoor burial sites. Among the evidence recovered were several items that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened in that underground chamber. A student identification card, its plastic surface clouded with age but still legible, confirmed that the female remains belonged to Jessica Morrison. But more significantly, investigators discovered a second ID card that identified the male victim as someone who had never been reported missing. Thomas Garrett was a 22-year-old graduate student in the university's history department, a quiet and studious young man who had been pursuing a master's degree in American colonial history. According to university records, Thomas had withdrawn from his studies in late October 1999. Citing family financial difficulties that required him to return home to help with his parents' struggling farm in rural Vermont. The discovery that Thomas Garrett had actually died in the library's basement on or around the same night as Jessica Morrison fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a case of a single missing student, but potentially a double homicide that had been concealed for 25 years. Detective Santos immediately began reconstructing Thomas Garrett's final weeks at Millbrook University. Searching for connections between him and Jessica Morrison, that might explain why they had both ended up in room B. What she discovered painted a picture of two students whose paths had intersected in ways that no one had previously understood. Thomas Garrett had been working as a research assistant in the library's Special Collections Department, a position that gave him extensive knowledge of the building's layout and access to areas typically restricted to staff members. His supervisor, Professor Emeritus Helen Cartwright, remembered him as a dedicated and reliable employee who often worked late into the evening, organizing archival materials and assisting faculty with research projects. More importantly, Professor Cartwright recalled that Thomas had been assigned to conduct an inventory of the basement storage areas in the weeks leading up to his supposed withdrawal from the university. The project had been part of a broader effort to catalog and digitize the library's historical collections, many of which had been stored in the basement levels for decades without proper documentation. The revelation that Thomas Garrett had legitimate access to room B47 during the same period when Jessica Morrison disappeared suggested a connection that investigators had never previously considered, but the nature of that connection remained unclear, and the evidence recovered from the scene raised as many questions as it answered. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed disturbing details about the final moments of both victims. Jessica Morrison appeared to have died from dehydration and exposure, her body showing no signs of physical trauma but positioned in a way that suggested she had been conscious when trapped in the room. The medical examiner estimated that she could have survived for several days in the confined space, gradually weakening as her body was deprived of food and water. Thomas Garrett's death had been more violent and immediate. The fractures to his skull were consistent with repeated blows from a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool. Additional injuries to his hands and arms suggested that he had attempted to defend himself before succumbing to his injuries. The positioning of the bodies within the room told a chilling story. Jessica had been found seated against the wall nearest the door, her skeletal remains facing the entrance, as if she had spent her final days waiting for rescue that never came. Thomas had been positioned near the opposite wall, his body collapsed in a way that suggested he had been attacked while standing. Between the two skeletons, crime scene technicians discovered several items that provided additional clues about what had transpired in room B47. A broken flashlight lay near Thomas's remains, its battery compartment corroded but its metal casing still intact. Several sheets of paper, too deteriorated to read but still recognizable as notebook pages, were scattered around Jessica's position. Perhaps most significantly, investigators found evidence that someone had attempted to barricade the door from the outside. Metal fragments discovered near the entrance were consistent with additional locks or securing devices that would have made escape impossible, even if the original lock had been damaged from within. The implications were terrifying. Someone had deliberately trapped Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett in room B47, leaving them to die in the darkness while their families and friends assumed they had simply vanished. The calculated cruelty of the crime suggested a perpetrator with intimate knowledge of the library's layout and the confidence that their actions would never be discovered. As news of the discovery spread throughout the Millbrook University community, the reaction was one of shock, horror, and profound grief. Students who had studied in the library for years struggled to comprehend that two murder victims had been entombed beneath their feet for the entirety of their academic careers. Faculty members who had taught Jessica Morrison found themselves reliving memories of a young woman whose potential had been violently cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. The media attention was intense and unrelenting. Television news crews from major networks descended on the small college town, broadcasting live reports from outside the library where the gruesome discovery had been made. National newspapers picked up the story, framing it as a shocking example of investigative failure and institutional cover-up that raised questions about safety and accountability at colleges across the country. Robert and Linda Morrison, now in their 70s and living quietly in a retirement community in Maine, learned about their daughter's fate through a phone call from Detective Santos on the morning of July. The news that Jessica had been found, coupled with the horrific circumstances of her death, reopened wounds that had never fully healed and introduced new layers of anguish that seemed almost unbearable. In a statement released through their attorney, the Morrison family expressed gratitude that their daughter had finally been found, while demanding a thorough investigation into how such a massive failure of law enforcement could have occurred. They also announced their intention to pursue legal action against both the university and the Millbrook Police Department for negligence in the original investigation. The Garrett family, meanwhile, was confronting the revelation that their son had never actually left the university at all. Thomas Garrett's parents had died several years earlier, never knowing that their son had been murdered rather than simply choosing to abandon his studies. His sister, Patricia Garrett Williams, lived in Colorado with her own family and had not spoken to her brother since he had supposedly returned to Vermont. Patricia's reaction to the news was complex and heartbreaking. In interviews with investigators, she revealed that her family had been hurt and confused by Thomas's sudden decision to leave graduate school without warning or explanation. They had interpreted his silence in the months following his supposed departure as a sign that he was angry with them for not being able to provide more financial support for his education. "We thought he was ashamed," Patricia told Detective Santos during their first conversation. "We thought he blamed us for not being able to help him finish his degree. All these years we carried that guilt, wondering if we had failed him somehow. To learn that he was murdered, that he never chose to leave us, it changes everything and nothing at the same time." The discovery in room B47 also raised urgent questions about who could have been responsible for such a calculated and horrific crime. The perpetrator would have needed detailed knowledge of the library's layout, access to restricted areas, and the ability to move freely throughout the building without arousing suspicion. They would also have needed the physical strength to overpower Thomas Garrett and the psychological capacity to leave two people to die slowly in a locked room. Detective Santos began developing a profile of potential suspects based on these requirements. Current and former library employees moved to the top of her list, particularly those who had worked in the building during 1999 and would have been familiar with the basement storage areas. Security personnel who had access to master keys and knowledge of patrol routes also warranted close examination. But as the investigation deepened, Santos discovered that the list of people with the necessary access and knowledge was frustratingly long. The library employed dozens of student workers, staff members, and faculty researchers who regularly used the building during evening hours. Maintenance personnel, cleaning crews, and security guards all possessed keys or access codes that would have allowed them to reach the basement levels. More troubling still was the realization that the original investigation in 1999 had focused almost exclusively on Jessica Morrison's disappearance, with no one considering the possibility that other students might also be missing. The fact that Thomas Garrett's supposed withdrawal from the university had never been questioned or investigated represented a critical oversight that had allowed a double murder to go undetected for 25 years. Detective Santos ordered a comprehensive review of all student withdrawals, transfers, and disappearances from Millbrook University between 1995 and 2005, searching for patterns or additional victims that might have been overlooked. What she discovered would prove even more disturbing than the crimes already uncovered. University records revealed at least 6 other students who had withdrawn or transferred during the same period under circumstances that, in retrospect, seemed suspicious. 3 of these individuals had supposedly left the university due to financial difficulties. 2 had cited family emergencies that required their immediate return home, and 1 had simply stopped attending classes without any official explanation. Follow-up investigations into these cases revealed a pattern that sent chills through the detective's spine. In every instance, the missing students had worked or studied in areas of the campus that gave them access to restricted spaces or after-hours facilities. Several had been employed in positions that required them to work alone during evening or weekend hours. And in each case, their departure from the university had been accepted without question by administrators, who were eager to avoid the complications and publicity that would accompany a missing person investigation. The possibility that room B47 had not been the only site where students had been murdered was too horrifying to contemplate. But Detective Santos knew she had no choice but to pursue every lead. She ordered ground-penetrating radar surveys of the library's foundation and surrounding grounds, searching for additional burial sites or hidden chambers that might contain more victims. As the investigation expanded, pressure mounted on university administrators to explain how such crimes could have occurred without detection. President Margaret Thornton, who had held the position since 2010, found herself defending an institution whose reputation for safety and academic excellence was rapidly crumbling under the weight of revelations about past failures. In a series of tense press conferences, President Thornton attempted to balance expressions of sympathy for the victims' families with assurances that the current administration was committed to full cooperation with law enforcement. But her carefully crafted statements did little to quell the growing outrage from students, parents, and alumni who demanded answers about how a double murder had remained hidden for 25 years. The faculty and staff who had worked at the university in 1999 found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigators attempted to identify anyone who might have had the means and opportunity to commit the crimes. Many of these individuals had retired or moved on to other positions in the intervening years, but Detective Santos was determined to interview every person who might possess relevant information. One name that appeared repeatedly in her investigation was Dr. Edmund Hartley, a former professor of medieval literature who had taught at Millbrook University from 1985 to 2003. Hartley had been known for his extensive research in the library's special collections, often working late into the evening in the basement archives where the oldest and most valuable manuscripts were stored. Several former colleagues described Dr. Hartley as an eccentric and sometimes difficult man who had clashed with other faculty members over access to research materials and funding for his projects. He had been particularly protective of his work area in the basement levels, becoming agitated when other researchers attempted to use the same spaces or examine materials he considered to be within his exclusive domain. More significantly, Dr. Hartley had been Thomas Garrett's graduate advisor during the young man's time at the university. According to academic records, the relationship between professor and student had been strained, with Thomas struggling to meet Dr. Hartley's exacting standards for research and analysis. Detective Santos attempted to locate Dr. Hartley for questioning, but discovered that the former professor had died in 2018 at the age of 73. He had spent his final years in a nursing home in upstate New York, suffering from advanced dementia that had robbed him of his memories and ability to communicate effectively. The timing of Dr. Hartley's death seemed almost too convenient, eliminating what might have been the investigation's most promising lead. But Santos refused to abandon this line of inquiry, instead focusing on uncovering everything she could about the professor's activities during the autumn of 19. What she discovered in Dr. Hartley's academic files and personal records would provide the key to understanding not only what had happened to Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett, but also the scope of crimes that had remained hidden within the walls of Millbrook University for more than 2 decades. As autumn returned to the New England campus, exactly 25 years after Jessica Morrison's disappearance, Detective Santos found herself racing against time to solve a case that seemed to grow more complex and disturbing with each new revelation. The discovery in room B47 had answered some questions while raising countless others, and the pressure to provide justice for the victims and their families was mounting with each passing day. But the detective had no way of knowing that the most shocking discoveries still lay ahead, waiting to be uncovered in the depths of Dr. Edmund Hartley's carefully preserved academic legacy. The truth about what had happened beneath Whitman Memorial Library was far more twisted and horrifying than anyone could have imagined, and its full revelation would shake the very foundations of Millbrook University to their core. The key to understanding Dr. Edmund Hartley's decades-long reign of terror lay buried within 17 bankers' boxes stored in the climate-controlled archives of Millbrook University's administrative building. These files, meticulously preserved according to the university's faculty records retention policy, contained the professor's complete academic correspondence, research notes, and personnel evaluations spanning his 18-year tenure at the institution. Detective Santos approached the task of reviewing Dr. Hartley's records with the methodical precision that had defined her career. Working alongside forensic accountant Jennifer Pike and university archivist Donald Chen, she began the painstaking process of examining thousands of documents that painted an equally disturbing picture of a predator who had used his academic authority to target vulnerable students for over a decade. The earliest troubling entries appeared in Dr. Hartley's personal research journals from 1987, just 2 years after he had joined the Millbrook faculty as an assistant professor. Written in his distinctive spidery handwriting, these notes initially appeared to document legitimate academic observations about student behavior and motivation. But as Santos read deeper, she recognized a pattern of surveillance and psychological profiling that extended far beyond normal professorial interest. Subject exhibits classic indicators of social isolation. Dr. Hartley had written about one unnamed student in September 1987. Limited family support structure, financial stress, evident in clothing and meal choices, demonstrates excessive gratitude for minor academic assistance, potential for emotional dependency. The clinical detachment of these observations was chilling enough. But subsequent entries revealed how Dr. Hartley had systematically exploited the vulnerabilities he identified. He would offer struggling students additional research opportunities that required them to work alone with him in the library's basement archives. He provided financial assistance in the form of paid research positions that came with implicit expectations of gratitude and loyalty. Most insidiously, he positioned himself as a mentor and father figure to young people who desperately needed support and guidance. Dr. Hartley's methods were sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. He selected victims who were unlikely to be missed immediately if they disappeared, students from distant states or troubled family backgrounds, graduate students whose social circles were limited to academic environments, individuals who were already isolated by financial stress or personal struggles. Among his papers, Detective Santos discovered a folder labeled Research Subjects that contained detailed psychological profiles of at least 23 students over the years. Each file included photographs, copies of academic transcripts, financial aid records, and personal information that Dr. Hartley had gathered through his various university connections. The level of detail was encyclopedic and deeply invasive, revealing that he had been stalking potential victims for weeks or months before making his approach. The folder also contained what appeared to be a ranking system, with students categorized according to their perceived vulnerability and the likelihood that their disappearance would trigger intensive investigation. Those rated as low risk were typically graduate students with limited local connections, while high-risk individuals were undergraduates with strong family ties or prominent campus profiles. Jessica Morrison's file was among the thickest in the collection, spanning nearly 6 months of surveillance and psychological analysis. Dr. Hartley had first noticed her during a guest lecture he had delivered in Professor Hartford's Research Methods class in April. His notes described Jessica's excessive empathy and need to rescue others as qualities that made her an ideal target for manipulation. Over the following months, Dr. Hartley had orchestrated several seemingly chance encounters with Jessica, always presenting himself as a kindly professor who admired her academic potential. He had offered her access to rare manuscripts in the library's special collections, suggesting that exposure to these materials would enhance her understanding of historical approaches to psychology. He had also identified her financial struggles and hinted at possible research opportunities that could provide much-needed income. The final entry in Jessica's file, dated October 14, 1999, one day before her disappearance, contained a single chilling sentence: "Subject has accepted invitation to review materials in B47. Proceed with Protocol 7. Detective Santos felt her blood run cold as she realized the implications of that entry. Dr. Hartley had lured Jessica Morrison to room B47 under the pretense of academic research, using her trust and financial desperation to draw her into a trap that had been months in the making. Thomas Garrett's file told a similar story, but with additional layers of manipulation that revealed the professor's escalating boldness and cruelty. As Hartley's research assistant, Thomas had been gradually drawn into his advisor's web through a combination of academic pressure and emotional manipulation. The young man's dedication to his graduate studies had made him an ideal accomplice, unknowingly helping to prepare the very room where he would eventually die. Dr. Hartley's notes revealed that he had instructed Thomas to conduct the basement inventory project as a way of familiarizing him with the library's hidden spaces and testing his willingness to work alone in isolated areas. The professor had also used Thomas to install additional locks and security measures in room B47, telling him that the modifications were necessary to protect valuable archival materials from theft or environmental damage. The psychological manipulation continued for weeks, with Dr. Hartley gradually introducing darker elements into their academic discussions. He shared obscure historical accounts of medieval torture methods and imprisonment, framing these conversations as scholarly research into historical attitudes toward punishment and social control. He encouraged Thomas to consider the psychological effects of isolation and confinement, presenting these topics as potential thesis material. By October 1999, Dr. Hartley had successfully transformed Thomas Garrett from student to unwitting accomplice, using him to prepare room B47 as a prison while simultaneously grooming Jessica Morrison as his next victim. The professor's notes revealed a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that demonstrated years of practice and refinement. But the most disturbing revelations came when Detective Santos discovered evidence that Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett had not been Dr. Hartley's first victims. Hidden within a hollowed-out medieval manuscript in the professor's office, investigators found a collection of photographs that documented at least 7 other crime scenes spanning the years from These images, taken with the same clinical detachment that characterized his written notes, showed young people in various states of distress and confinement within different locations throughout the university campus. The photographs were accompanied by detailed journals that described Dr. Hartley's experiments in psychological manipulation and control. He had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for isolating and terrorizing his victims, using their academic dependence on him to ensure compliance and silence. Some students had been held captive for days or weeks before being released with threats that prevented them from reporting their experiences. Others had simply vanished, their disappearances explained away through the same fictitious withdrawals and transfers that had initially concealed Thomas Garrett's murder. Dr. Hartley's journals revealed the twisted logic that had driven his crimes. He viewed his actions as legitimate academic research into human psychology under extreme stress, justifying his behavior as scientific inquiry that would advance understanding of trauma, survival instincts, and social control mechanisms. He had even begun drafting what he called research papers based on his observations, academic documents that transformed horrific crimes into scholarly abstracts, filled with clinical terminology and theoretical frameworks. The scope of Dr. Hartley's crimes became clearer as investigators cross-referenced his journals with university records from the 1990s. At least 12 students who had supposedly withdrawn or transferred during that decade could not be located through conventional means. Their families had lost contact with them. Their forwarding addresses led to vacant lots or non-existent buildings, and their social security numbers showed no subsequent activity. Detective Santos realized she was confronting not just a double murder, but potentially a series of crimes that had claimed more than a dozen victims over the course of a decade. The institutional failures that had allowed Dr. Hartley to operate with impunity were staggering in their scope and implications. University administrators had repeatedly ignored warning signs and suspicious circumstances, choosing to accept convenient explanations rather than conducting thorough investigations. Faculty colleagues had dismissed concerns about Dr. Hartley's increasingly erratic behavior as academic eccentricity, Security personnel had provided him with master keys and unrestricted access to campus facilities without adequate oversight or accountability. Most damning of all, the university's mental health counseling center had received at least 6 reports from students who described disturbing encounters with Dr. Hartley during the night. These reports had been filed away without investigation, their contents never shared with law enforcement or university administration. The counselors who had taken these reports had since moved on to other positions, but their notes revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that should have triggered immediate intervention. The revelation of these missed opportunities devastated the families of Dr. Hartley's victims and raised questions about institutional liability that would reverberate through the legal system for years to come. The Morrison family's attorneys announced their intention to pursue not only financial compensation but also systemic reforms that would prevent similar tragedies from occurring at other institutions. As Detective Santos pieced together the final events that had led to Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett's deaths, she discovered that Dr. Hartley's plan had gone catastrophically wrong on the night of October 5th. According to his journal entries, Dr. Hartley had intended to use Thomas Garrett as an accomplice in confining Jessica Morrison, believing that the graduate student's emotional dependence on his advisor would ensure compliance. But when Thomas had realized the true nature of what was happening in room B47, he had attempted to intervene and free Jessica from her captivity. The struggle that followed had resulted in Thomas Garrett's death and left Dr. Hartley with 2 bodies instead of 1 living victim. His subsequent journal entries revealed panic and desperation as he realized that his carefully planned experiment had become a double murder that could destroy his career and freedom. Dr. Hartley had chosen to seal room B47 and fabricate explanations for both students' disappearances, counting on the university's reluctance to investigate missing persons cases and his own reputation as a respected faculty member to protect him from scrutiny. His plan had succeeded for 25 years, allowing him to continue his career while Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett's bodies remained entombed beneath the library where hundreds of students continued to study each day. The professor's final journal entry, dated November 15, 1999, exactly 1 month after the murders, contained a chilling reflection on his crimes. The subjects proved less resilient than anticipated. Future research protocols must account for variables introduced by emotional attachments and moral resistance. The basement facility remains secure, but may require alternative disposal methods for subsequent studies. That entry suggested Dr. Hartley had intended to continue his crimes using different methods, but university records showed that his behavior became increasingly erratic in the years following Jessica and Thomas's deaths. Colleagues noted his growing paranoia and social isolation, his declining academic productivity, and his sudden reluctance to work alone with graduate students. Detective Santos theorized that the unplanned violence of October 15th had shaken Dr. Hartley's confidence and forced him to abandon his more elaborate schemes. His subsequent victims during the early 2000s says to have been killed quickly and their bodies disposed of off-campus, eliminating the risk of discovery that had eventually exposed his earlier crimes. The professor's descent into dementia during his final years had ultimately protected him from facing justice for his crimes. By the time his condition became evident in 2015, he had already forgotten the details of his past actions, leaving behind only the documentary evidence that would eventually expose the full scope of his depravity. As the investigation concluded in November 2024, Detective Santos faced the daunting task of providing closure to families who had lived with uncertainty and grief for decades. The discovery of Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett's remains had answered the question of what had happened to them, but it had also revealed a systematic pattern of institutional failure that had enabled Dr. Hartley's crimes and concealed their consequences. The Morrison family held a memorial service for Jessica on November 15, 2024, exactly 25 years after Dr. Hartley's final journal entry. The ceremony took place in the same chapel where Jessica had attended services during her time at Millbrook University, drawing hundreds of former classmates, professors, and community members, who wanted to honor her memory and express their grief over her tragic fate. Robert and Linda Morrison, now frail but determined to see their daughter's story told completely, spoke briefly about the young woman who had been taken from them at the age of 19. Their words were simple but powerful, focusing not on the horror of Jessica's death, but on the beauty of her life and the potential that had been stolen by Dr. Hartley's cruelty. Jessica believed in the power of education to heal and transform lives, Linda Morrison said, her voice steady despite her tears. She would want her story to serve as a warning that protects other young people from suffering the same fate. If her death can prevent even one other family from experiencing this loss, then perhaps some meaning can be found in this tragedy. Thomas Garrett's sister, Patricia Garrett Williams, had flown in from Colorado to attend the service and finally learned the truth about her brother's fate. The revelation that Thomas had died attempting to save Jessica Morrison had provided her with a measure of comfort, confirming her memories of him as a fundamentally decent person who would have risked his own safety to protect others. "I always wondered why Thomas never called home," Patricia said during a brief interview with local news media. "Now I know it wasn't because he was angry with us or ashamed of leaving school. He was trying to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. That's the brother I remember, and that's how I want him to be remembered." The legal ramifications of Dr. Hartley's crimes extended far beyond the criminal investigation. Millbrook University faced a series of civil lawsuits from victims' families that would ultimately result in settlements totaling over $40 million. More importantly, the institution was forced to implement comprehensive reforms to its security procedures, mental health services, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. President Margaret Thornton announced her resignation in December 2024, acknowledging that the institutional failures revealed by the investigation had occurred under multiple administrations, but accepting responsibility for the university's response to the crisis. Her replacement would be tasked with rebuilding the institution's reputation and implementing the systemic changes necessary to restore public confidence in campus safety. The Whitman Memorial Library underwent extensive renovations that eliminated the maze-like basement storage areas where Dr. Hartley had committed his crimes. Room B47 was sealed permanently and converted into a memorial space dedicated to Jessica Morrison, Thomas Garrett, and the other victims whose names had been discovered through the investigation. Detective Santos retired from the Millbrook Police Department in March 2025, having solved the most significant case of her career, but carrying the weight of knowing how many victims could have been saved if the original investigation had been more thorough. She established a consulting practice specializing in cold case reviews, using her experience with the Morrison case to help other law enforcement agencies avoid similar investigative failures. The media attention surrounding the case gradually faded as other news cycles captured public attention, but the story of Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett became part of the broader national conversation about campus safety and institutional accountability. Their names were invoked in congressional hearings about college security measures and cited in academic studies examining the psychology of predatory behavior in educational settings. For the families of Dr. Hartley's victims, the conclusion of the investigation brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Questions that had haunted them for decades had finally been answered, but those answers revealed horrors that were almost unbearable to contemplate. The knowledge that their loved ones had suffered and died while institutional authorities failed to protect them would remain a source of anger and pain for the rest of their lives. Yet there was also a sense of justice in knowing that Dr. Hartley's crimes had finally been exposed and that measures were being taken to prevent similar tragedies. The Memorial Scholarship established in Jessica Morrison's name continued to support psychology students who demonstrated her commitment to helping others, ensuring that her legacy would inspire future generations of mental health professionals. As winter settled over Millbrook University in early 2025, the campus began the slow process of healing from revelations that had shaken its very foundations. Students walked past the memorial plaque outside the Whitman Memorial Library, reading the names of Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett while trying to comprehend the evil that had once lurked beneath their feet. The Gothic towers of the library still cast long shadows across the quad, but they no longer concealed the secrets that had poisoned the institution for 25 years. The truth about Dr. Edmund Hartley's crimes had finally been told, providing closure for grieving families while serving as a stark reminder of the vigilance required to protect vulnerable young people from those who would exploit their trust and ambition. In the end, Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett's deaths had not been in vain, if they succeeded in preventing future tragedies through the reforms and awareness their story had generated. Their memory would live on, not only in the hearts of those who loved them, but in the institutional changes designed to ensure that no other students would suffer the fate that had befallen them in the darkness beneath Whitman Memorial Library. The investigation was officially closed on April 15, 2025, exactly 25 years and 6 months after Jessica Morrison had walked across the campus quad for the final time. The case files were archived with the knowledge that while justice could never truly be achieved for victims who had been failed so completely by the institutions meant to protect them, the truth about their fate had finally been revealed, and their stories would serve as a warning for generations to come. The autumn leaves would continue to fall around Millbrook University each October, but they would never again conceal the kind of evil that Dr. Edmund Hartley had brought to that supposedly safe and nurturing academic community. Jessica Morrison and Thomas Garrett's legacy would be one of prevention, awareness, and the hard-won knowledge that even the most trusted institutions must be held accountable for the safety of those placed in their care.